Number 11, Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for State Services. What were the, quote, high-profile matters in education last year that contributed to strained relations across the education sector, end quote, and why did they lead to the resignation of Lesley Longstone as the Secretary of Education?
Speaker.
Honourable Jonathan Coleman.
Mr Speaker, an example is Canterbury Schools. Ms Longstone's reasons for her resignation are a matter between her and the State Services Commissioner.
Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Did the Minister of Education convey any specific concerns about Lesley Longstone's performance to the State Services Commissioner? If so, what was the nature of those concerns?
Honourable Jonathan
Mr
Coleman.
Speaker, you'd have to ask the State Services Commissioner that.
Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the Minister for State Services is the Minister responsible for those matters to the House. He has no ability to say they're simply not his responsibility. He is the Minister. He is responsible.
Can we have the question again, please?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, did the Minister of Education convey any specific concerns about Lesley Longstone's performance to the State Services Commissioner? If so, what was the nature of those concerns?
You'd have to ask the State Services Commissioner that.
Point of order.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. I think this is actually quite a serious issue, and I want to draw your attention to McGee, because this is a matter that has come up in the House before. Page 555 of McGee, and I'll just read a short extract rather than the entire context of it. But ministers become answerable to the House for many matters over which they have no legal powers in respect of the actions of public officials who are not subject to the legal control of ministers. Legal responsibility and political responsibility are different things. Thus, questions relating to actions taken by the State Services Commission in the course of carrying out its legal functions in regard to the appointment of a Chief Executive are held to involve ministerial responsibility. These are matters relating to the State Services Commissioner's employment of a Chief Executive of a department. The Minister is responsible to this House for those decisions.
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, Mr Hipkins quite rightly points to McGee as being an authority on how these things should be considered. But in no way does that give any less validity to the answer given by the Minister to the question that was asked.
It's an interesting one. So, Honourable David Parker.
It would be permissible for the Minister to say he doesn't know, he hasn't been informed, but it's not permissible for him to say that it's not within his responsibility. Then the House and the public can judge whether the Minister's doing his job properly, but it would be in order, an answer that would be in order. The current answer isn't.
I'll hear from the Honourable Trevor Mallard.
And sir, it's probably a point with which you're aware, having been a long-serving cabinet minister, but ministers responsible for areas do get reports on these matters, sir. And while I only had 6 years as State Services Minister and nothing of this shape, anything which came close to it would result in a report, which of course the Minister would have to read.
I'm going to invite the member to ask the supplementary question again.
Mr Speaker, did the Minister of Education convey any specific concerns about Lesley Longstone's performance to the State Services Commissioner? If so, what was the nature of those concerns?
Honourable Jonathan
Speaker,
Coleman.
this is an employment matter that's an operational issue, and it's a matter between the State Services Commissioner and Lesley Longstone, anything to do with her employment. And I'm not going to break that confidence here in this House, because Ms Longstone deserves that protection.
Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I think I've established the case in McGee. The primary question that I asked the Minister was quite specific, and the supplementary is directly related to the primary question. It is an answer that he could have been expected to have anticipated and prepared for in coming to the House prepared to answer these questions.
The difficulty I have as Speaker, at the end of the day, I can't design an answer to the member's satisfaction. We've had the question put 3 times. The member is clearly not satisfied. You have further supplementaries. I invite the member to use them. Point of order, Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Okay. Mr Speaker, that is the second time, I think, in 2 weeks that you have ruled, which I take as a new ruling, that after, I think, 3 attempts that you've given the questioner to answer the question, you are satisfied, rather than ruling that the Minister must provide an appropriate answer, that he's off the hook. And I invite you to think about your ruling, because, no, it is the correct, sir. On 2 occasions, you've said we've had 3 goes at it, that's it, can't do anything else, and that means a Minister can avoid answering a question 3 times and disappear. That's a disgrace, sir.
Speaking to the point of order, Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, regardless of the theatrics of that last point of order, the reality is that the Minister did answer the question.
Yeah, I think for the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove to suggest that any Minister who has asked the same question 3 times is off the hook or through scot-free, I don't accept that for 1 minute. Was there a further point of order? Further point of order from Honourable
Mr Speaker, my point was this, that given that you've ruled the same way twice, you may not have the interpretation that a Minister's off the hook, but that is the effect, because you've said to the questioner, we've had three goes, and that's it, you can do no more. Now, I just simply say, sir, you govern standing orders, you have critical powers and you can do more, but effectively a Minister could give the same answer 3 times and then it's, white flag, it's all over. That's actually the effect of your ruling. A Minister's off the hook.
Yeah, well, I don't agree with that last point made by Honourable Clayton Cosgrove. The Minister has given an answer. It may not be an answer that's acceptable to the member asking the question, but it is an answer. The Minister on the last occasion invoked public interest and the privacy of an individual in his answer. Honourable David Parker.
I never heard the Minister invoke a public interest to refuse answering, and I listened to the same answer 3 times in a row. The Speaker didn't hear the claim for public interest in the first 2 answers.
The Minister clearly spoke about it being a private employment matter. Is there further supplementaries? Point of order, Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr Speaker, a Minister declining to answer a question because it's not in the public interest to do so.
Order. I've heard quite sufficient. The member didn't decline to answer on that basis. He included that within his answer. I have ruled that the Minister has addressed the question. I acknowledge it's not to the satisfaction of the member asking the question. I'm giving the opportunity for further supplementaries, if Krista, or we will move to the next question. Point of order, Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. How can the Minister on the one hand have been said to have addressed the question and on the other hand be said to not have to address the question because it's not in the public interest to do so?
Because I have answered that to the same point made by the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove. I have established a regime by which if a question is not answered to a satisfaction, then we have the question 3 times. Beyond that, we've got to move on. Otherwise, we could sit in this House on the same supplementary for a long time. Now, we are moving on. I'll hear from Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr Speaker, I think there's some confusion here because you use the language public interest where there is specific standing orders, Speaker's rulings and McGee around those words. I think probably, sir, that was a mistake. And if you hadn't said that, we wouldn't have had quite this problem.
And I accept, Mr Mallard, that I'm not absolutely perfect on this occasion. Chris Hipkins, further supplementary?
Mr Speaker, did Lesley Longstone undertake any action in her role as Secretary of Education that was inconsistent with the Minister's wishes? If so, what were those actions?
Honourable Jonathan.
Well, you'd really have to ask the Minister that.
Mr Speaker.
You just made her vulnerable.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
I invite the member to ask the question again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, did Lesley Longstone undertake any action in her role as Secretary of Education that was inconsistent with the Minister's wishes? If so, what were those actions?
I presume you're talking about the Minister of Education, and you would have to ask her.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, you'll be aware we did try to ask the Minister of Education about those very issues, and it was transferred to the Minister of State Services. The quote in my primary question comes from that.
I certainly wasn't aware of that information, actually, but on this occasion I invite the member to ask his question a third time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, did Lesley Longstone undertake any action in her role as Secretary of Education that was inconsistent with the Minister's wishes? If so, what were those actions?
I don't know, because I'm not the Minister of Education. You should ask Ms Parata.
No.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will you rule that if we put this question to the Minister of Education, that in fact she will be required to ask it? Because we have put this question to the Minister of Education and it was transferred to the Minister of State Services, who is now refusing to answer.
I'm unaware of that transfer. I accept that might have been. I was certainly unaware of that. The Minister has had 3 opportunities to answer it, clearly not to his satisfaction. I invite the member to ask further. No. Point of order, Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, well, actually, no, it's not a circus. All we're seeing here is a clash between the different requirements upon ministers. On the one hand, the requirement of the House for ministers to answer questions, and that's fair enough. On the other hand, and particularly in relation to employment matters, a State Sector Act that gives ministers a different set of responsibilities with respect to employment issues than any other issues, it does, that the law applies in this House the same as it applies outside of this House to ministers with respect to employment matters. And those employment matters often will involve, for instance, confidentiality agreements in the same way as a direct parallel to commercial confidentiality when ministers get asked about those sort of issues. Now, I'm not saying it's easy to draw the line, but somewhere we'll have to find a practice where ministers answer the questions up to the point where they have to respect the law that binds them with respect to employment matters and agreements that may be made which are protected, actually, from all scrutiny in the pursuance of resolving employment matters.
Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Mr. Speaker, this is not a new issue for the House. It has been canvassed many times before, and ministers have answered questions before. Ministers answered questions on Christine Rankin, for example, going way back when, and that was a Labor government that had to answer those questions. Why should this government be held to a lesser standard?
Because Mr. Hipkins, the question has been answered. The difficulty I have as the Speaker is it clearly hasn't been answered to your satisfaction. I have some sympathy for you. I've allowed you to put the question 3 times to try and get a more fulsome answer. I don't think there's anything more I can do to assist, apart from inviting you to ask further supplementaries.
Mr. Speaker,
I'm inviting
point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Chris. It better be a fresh point of order.
It is a fresh point of order, Mr. Speaker, and that for several supplementary questions now, I've used 2, several supplementaries that the Minister has refused to answer. They were directly related to my primary question, which the Minister could reasonably have been expected to prepare for. Now, it is not unreasonable for the opposition to get somewhat annoyed, and for the public of New Zealand to get somewhat annoyed when ministers don't make an effort to come to the House prepared to answer the questions. This is an issue of public interest. It involves a significant payout of taxpayers' money, and the opposition and the public should be able to expect the government to answer on that issue.
And the member makes a very... I'll hear from Honourable Jonathan Coleman.
Mr. Speaker, the questions have been answered. He just hasn't got the answers that he's demanding.
I'll deal with that. Honourable Chris Hipkins makes a very good point. I accept that you have genuinely attempted to raise the questions. I'm trying to assist the member. I invite the member to raise further supplementaries. I think that's the only way forward on this occasion. And I'm giving the member an additional supplementary if he so requires it. Right, Honourable Winston.
Speaker, before Mr Hipkins puts his question, what needs to be sorted out was something that you said you weren't aware of, but which the Clerk of the House did make you aware of. Namely, that the question had been to the Minister of Education, refused and therefore transferred to this Minister here. Now, before this Minister gets up to answer the question, surely he should not be allowed to hide under the previous defence, which is what he just said again, this time round, or to be deliberately obtuse when the answer is clear as daylight. He has a responsibility to answer now.
I think both sides. It was last week's question which was similar that was transferred rather than today's.
I've invited the member to ask a further supplementary. Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Supplementary question to the Minister. Who else, other than the Minister of Education, did Lesley Longstone have a strained relationship with?
Honourable Jonathan Coleman.
Well, how would I know?
Speaker, point of order.
I invite the member. Order! I'm trying to assist the opposition. It would be helpful if they would remain quiet. I invite the member to ask his question again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, who else, other than the Minister of Education, did Lesley Longstone have a strained relationship with?
Honourable Jonathan
Once
Coleman.
again, how would I know? I don't know Ms Longstone, sorry.
I invite the member to ask the question again, and then we will be moving on.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, who else, other than the Minister of Education, did Lesley Longstone have a strained relationship with?
I'll put it another way. I don't know.
Speaker, Mr Speaker, the Minister is showing an absolute contempt for this Parliament.
No.
He is responsible.
Order. That last question adequately addressed, the last answer adequately addressed the question. He said he didn't know. No, I'm not taking any more. Order. The member will resume his seat. I am moving on to the next question. Or, if it's about that, then the member will be removed from the House.
No,
Order! Order! If it's a point of order regarding any decision I have made with regards to the questions and the answers given by the Honourable Jonathan Coleman, I've made a decision, and that's it. To continue to bring questions on points of order about that will lead to more disorder in the House. We need to move on. Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr Speaker, are you ruling that the opposition are not allowed to use their allocation of supplementaries to further question this minister?
I am certainly ruling that if members from any party continue to take points of order which continually raise exactly the same point, then I will move on. Now, if Mr Hipkins has a further supplementary, I'm only too happy to hear that.
Question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, was he, as Minister for State Services, or the Minister of Education, informed, consulted or asked to approve the $425,000 payout to Lesley Longstone?
Honourable Jonathan Coleman.
What I can tell that member is that the payout was within the Auditor General's guide-out. Let me finish. Yeah.
Does the Minister want the question repeated?
Well, no, I can answer the question.
Okay.
Yeah. What I can say is that the State Services Commissioner formulated the payment package and he consulted the Auditor General's guidelines for it, and he came to us asking for final advice, and we were told that that was well within the guidelines, and so that's understood. But the key point is that it was a package formulated by the State Services Commissioner in full compliance with the Auditor General's guidance for public service payouts.
Supplementary question, Chris.
Supplementary questions. What were the specific reasons given to him by the State Services Commissioner for wanting to provide a $425,000 payout to Lesley Longstone?
Honourable Jonathan Coleman.
As it said in the press release at the time, there was $157,523.33 payment owed to Ms Longstone for outstanding holiday and payment in lieu of notice, and an additional severance payment of 6 months' remuneration of $267,952. That totalled, as we know, $425,475.33, in line with the Auditor General's guidelines in such cases.
Point of order, Chris.
Mr Speaker, I asked him for the reasons for the payout. I didn't ask him how the payout was calculated.
Would the member please repeat the question?
I'll try and repeat the question because I made that one up. But what were the specific reasons the State Services Commissioner gave him for wanting to make a $425,000 payout to Lesley Longstone?
The reason was that she resigned and had to have her contract paid out.
Further supplementary? Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. The Minister indicated in his earlier answer that they came to him before the Secretary of Education resigned from her position, seeking the approval of that resignation. So how can his answer possibly be acceptable?
The member then had an opportunity to ask his a supplementary second time, and the Minister has adequately addressed that. The Minister has answered the question. Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, we've run out of our allocation of supplementary questions for the day. And one of the reasons that we have done that is that the Minister's consistently refused to answer most of the questions that I have asked him. So I'm asking that you allocate additional supplementary so that we can continue.
Point of order. Speaking to the point of order, Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, that would assume that the people asking a question have no responsibility to ask questions that will elicit answers that are according to their previous plan. In the last case, sir, he asked for reasons. He was told severance pay and holiday pay and seemed to think that was some sort of an outrageous answer.
I am advised that the Labor Party still has 2 further supplementaries if they wish to use them. Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, did the Minister approve the payout to Lesley Longstone before or after her resignation?
Honourable Jonathan Coleman.
I can tell you the exact timeline. Thursday, 6th of December, State Services Commission briefed me that Ms Longstone had decided to resign. Tuesday, the 18th of December, I received a fax report advising that she'd formally tendered her resignation effective from the 8th of February and seeking approval of a severance payment with Crown Law's certified approval. That's it.
Further supplementary?
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, was the resignation of Lesley Longstone conditional upon the payout of $425,000?
Honourable Jonathan
Well, that
Coleman.
actually is really getting to the heart of an employment matter, and that once again is a matter for the State Services Commissioner. Sorry.
Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, I go right back to the ruling that I gave, or the McGee ruling that I gave you at the very beginning of this question. The Minister of State Services is the person responsible to this House and through this House to the public for these payments. He has said himself that he approved this payment. He is therefore responsible for answering questions about it.
I think the Minister order. The Minister has adequately addressed the answer to the member's question. I move.
Is it before or after?
Point of order, Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Mr Speaker, I just want to take you back. You invited, I think, the House to consider that you had no further options after 3 questions were put. Can I offer some assistance that you may wish to review the tapes of your predecessor, Lockwood Smith, because he had a very elegant way of dealing with it, and it provides an additional tool to
I thank the member for his contribution. Question number 9. Point of order, Honourable David Parker.
Mr Speaker, that question was a simple one. It was whether the offer was conditional.
I have moved and said the question was addressed. Would the member please resume his seat? I have stated to the House, and now you are questioning a ruling that I have given as Speaker. I said that that particular supplementary question had been addressed by the Minister. We are moving on. Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I've listened patiently to your rulings on this issue, and I seek your direction. One of the oldest rulings in the House is 1725. It's from 1892. It stood the test of time. It says an answer to a question ought to be given if it can be given consistently with the public interest. I seek your direction. Are you standing by that ruling, or are you seeking to overturn it?
I refer you to Speaker's ruling 1576, ministers not answerable for personal actions taken in respect of any identified member of staff. We move now to question 12 in the name of Jackie Dean.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for the Environment and asks...
Point of order, Honourable David Parker.
Mr Speaker, I don't understand how the Speaker's answer addresses the question that Dr. Norman put, because the question was, could it be within the public interest to answer the question if the Minister could have...
Order. Now the member is continuing to dispute a ruling that I've given. That will only lead to disorder. Order. A new point of order, Chris.
Order, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, because I reviewed the Speaker's rulings and standing orders regarding this matter before today's question, and 1576, which you have referred to, I just want to seek some further clarification for you, because the way I read that, it was to do with individual employees within the public service, but chief executives fall into a somewhat different category in that they are employed by the State Services Commissioner. There are different parts of the legislation that relate specifically to those. So and I'm not necessarily asking you to give a ruling on it right now, but I would like you to consider whether in fact there should be a different rule for chief executives, because there has to be some accountability for chief executives to this House. And it seems to me that Speaker's ruling, if applied to chief executives, would circumvent that process.
And I will certainly give consideration to the point that's been raised. Question number 12, Jackie Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister for the Environment, what recent announcements